Great. Well, welcome to all of you who have joined us here this morning in the U.S., afternoon in Europe, and evening in other parts of the world. So thank you all for joining. Um, just a quick introduction to the process here. To the extent that anyone has questions, please do enter in the Q&A function. We'll try and save some time at the end to answer questions. I know there were some people who submitted questions in advance, which is terrific. We'll try and get to those as well. And then we will be sharing the document that we're going to go through today after the session. So you will get a copy of that. So anyway, thank you all very much for joining. We're going to talk about a proactive approach to OT security, and I'll describe more what we mean by that as we talk here today. First, by way of introduction, I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve. I'll talk a little bit more about Verve in a second. I've been with the company for a little over 5 years. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years of my career with McKinsey & Company as a senior partner there, helping clients with their industrial tech and other types of transformation journeys. And then Rick Kahn is also with us today. Rick is our VP of Solutions. He's got about 20 years of experience in ICS security with Matricon, Honeywell, folks like that, and been with us for about 5 years or so. Just by way of background on the company, Verve has been in the business for about 30 years. So we started as a control systems integrator, so helping design control systems for power, water, chemicals, steel, consumer packaged goods, etc. About 15 years ago, due to the regulations introduced in the United States around NERC SIP for the power industry, we began to help our clients protect those critical systems from a cybersecurity perspective, and built the first version of what we now call the Verve Security Center. And that platform essentially tries to bring IT security into the OT realm. We've been doing this for, like I said, about 15 years, helping clients mature their overall security journey in the OT landscape, and all built off of our knowledge of the control systems themselves. And then we provide a range of services that go along with that. And so what we're going to talk about today is built on those experiences. It's built on real world practical, kind of examples of how industrial organizations have taken this proactive approach to be able to deal with the new and emerging risks that are ongoing. So with that, let me dive in. So 3 main points we're going to talk about today. The first is just for background purposes, a little bit more about the risk landscape and particularly the compliance requirements that are emerging. The world of OT security has come a long way from those first regulations 15 years ago. And we are now living in a much greater risk landscape, as well as a much more robust compliance and regulatory landscape in different industry sectors, different geographies, et cetera. So we spent some time, and that has implications about the way we should think about protecting these systems. Secondly, then, those new demands are requiring us to take what we call a more proactive approach to security management, even in these challenging environments that we all work in OT. What we mean by this is a way of actually doing security management and actually taking actions to protect the systems, rather than simply detecting possible threats, but actually managing them to protect them. And we'll talk more about what we mean by that as we go today. And then finally, the good news is that over the last 15 years, we've learned with our clients about how to do this effectively and safely and efficiently. And so we're going to talk through an approach that is very feasible, effective, and does not cause undue risks to the OT systems, but allows us to achieve that same kind of proactive security that we think of in the IT side in the OT realm. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me start with that threat landscape. To try to simplify this down, we've created a bit of a mnemonic to allow us to remember it, which we call AIR raid. first of all, on the attack side, so the first A, um, ICS or industrial control systems, OT, is becoming a much greater target for commercial hackers. So if you think about all of the, the stories that we've heard about over the last 5, 7 years, Stuxnet or the grid in the Ukraine, et cetera, these have been, nation state sponsored things. What's happened over the last 3 to 4 years is the commercial hacking community has discovered that OT is a very, very profitable place to focus through using ransomware and those types of things. Not to say that we're not concerned anymore about nation states and APTs, et cetera. Absolutely we are. But the volume has increased as the profitability of going after OT systems has been demonstrated. Number two, IT. So IT is now becoming a greater part of OT systems, whether that be through connectivity or frankly, just the fact that we've got Windows devices, et cetera. And with that, they bring along vulnerabilities, they bring along risks, and therefore create extra angles of possible attack. The first R that we have to realize is that regulations are going up as a result of these attacks. Increasing compliance requirements from whether it be TSA in the US or in the Middle East, the new standard, for instance, the Saudi standards that just came out. Chile now has implemented NERC in its geographies for its power industry. So anyway, these regulations are growing and we'll talk more about them, but they're very prescriptive in what they require. Resource constraints, as these vulnerabilities and threats grow, there's not an increase in staff, right? We're all dealing with limitations in staff. Forget the whole issue of COVID, which only exacerbates this more. Access, so more and more access, IIoT, et cetera, again, creates new openings for threats. Another somewhat new phenomenon over the last 2 to 3 years is insurers. So as organizations have gone out to get insurance for cyber, as the number of events has increased, cyber insurance has gone up dramatically in price, but it's also the requirements of what we have to demonstrate for insurers has also gone up. It ties, in a way, it's similar to the compliance requirements for regulators, in that I now need to start demonstrating to an insurer that I'm doing the same kind of security in OT that I'm doing in IT. If I want to keep my insurance, even if I want to, certainly if I don't want it to go up, but even if I want to keep my cyber insurance. It's a big deal that board of directors are dealing with right now. And then finally, the board themselves, asking for measurable improvement. OT is no longer kind of that thing hidden away to the board. It's now front and center, and they're looking for ways that they can demonstrate improvement. So all of these elements, as I said, the air raid are starting to drive greater needs and urgency in the area of OT cyber. Just some quick facts behind that. So if we think about the degree of risk, these are both statistics from the SANS ICS survey. When you look at what is the degree of risk, as you see 2021, which is the last time they did the survey, right? The severe risks, basically more than doubled, almost tripled. And so people are much more concerned than they were 2 years ago. And what's interesting is that ransomware or financially motivated attacks have now become by far the most important, the most concerning threat vector. And if you looked, 2 years ago, it was, fourth or fifth on the list. 2 years later, it's now by far number one. And this is our point about financial motivated hackers are now driving this significant risk around ransomware, particularly. I don't have to, I guess, as a lot of people on this call are OT practitioners, I don't need to preach to the choir on how impactful these types of attacks can be. These are just some examples of the number of days of plant time lost. And for each one of these, it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars per day if I don't have production going on in the plant. And a lot of these attacks that we're seeing are causing physical shutdown. We all know that the ransom money is significant, certainly. By the same token, the shutdown costs are even greater. And so these are the kinds of risks that we're facing. And those are financial risks, so the average cost of a day of downtime, as an example, the organization had 36 plants networked together, exposed all of them at the same time to ransomware because they weren't segmented with a significant recovery cost. There's operational issues. So one of the things that we've all moved to in manufacturing is just-in-time delivery, so that if you're down, it doesn't impact you only. It starts to have knock-on effects in the supply chain. And then finally, safety and regulations. Whether it be that you shut down the safety system and therefore you have to shut down the plant, or worse, that you actually have physical impact to the facility and therefore potential loss of life. All of these things where cyber and physical come together used to have a much greater potential risk. And then the final point here is around regulatory requirements. So as I mentioned before, because of the range of threats and the emergence of risks, regulations are becoming a much greater part of our world in industrial controls security. And that has specific important implications. So number one, it means we got to start thinking about auditing and assessing, right? We need, instead of, okay, great, I have some network intrusion detection perimeter, so I've kind of checked the box on security. No, I'm going to actually have to document. I'm going to have to prove that I've done patching, or prove that I've gotten systems hardened, or if I can't do those things, I'm going to prove that I have some form of compensating control. And that's going to be for insurers, it's going to be for regulators, et cetera. I then have to start doing what we call OT systems management. So I have to start managing the systems, whether that be knowing inventory, managing vulnerabilities, tracking actions for change management. We need to enable us to do that because the regulators are asking for that. Reporting, being able to consolidate all of this efficiently into a reporting tools so that we can provide that to regulators. And then finally, this starts to become a much more board level discussion. As regulations increase the board, this becomes a risk committee item for the board, and therefore they're starting to get more involved. And so it starts to change the way we need to think about what we do and raise the bar on our proactive approach to the OT security. And so given those demands, what are we going to have to do? Well, the industry reality of increasing threats, increasing regulation, increasing board involvement has, we think, three broad implications. First, we're going to need to be able to demonstrate progress in risk reduction, right? So it's not only being able to detect things, but we're actually going to have to demonstrate how we're moving from quote unquote red to green in reducing our risk, achieving IT type security in OT. It's more than just inventory or network visibility. It's actually showing how we're improving the protections and ensuring that those protections are applied and maintained, whether it be user and account management, patching, et cetera, and then including auditable results at the end of the day. The second main theme is moving from just alerting to accelerated response. So, it's great if we've got a SOC and we're sending logs to the SOC, or we're sending, packet inspection to the SOC, but we have to be able to do something with it. We have to be able to move to quote unquote accelerated response. The first part of that is a much more holistic XDR type of an approach in OT. It means also being able to take a remediating action when we see an alert, what we refer to as a least disruptive response. So what is the response we can take that is the least disruptive thing we can do to operations? If the threat is to a particular account, let's go deal with that account. Let's not just shut down the entire system. And then the third one is to make sure that these approaches that we take are efficient, because we'll talk about this, right? We don't have the bodies to scale this, to do this if we don't scale it somehow. And OT safe, obviously. We don't want to be disrupting operations in the process. So these are what we're seeing as the implications of, okay, what are we going to have to do if we're going to address these new realities? The first thing that we're seeing organizations do, and this is similar to the surveys that come out, is starting to apply a standards-based approach, right? The IT security world has been using standards for a long time, and what we're now seeing is those are moving over into OT, And frankly, NIST CSF is still by far the number one used standard, which is obviously one that can cross over between IT and OT. But then we're also seeing things like IEC 62443 grow in its use. And I would expect if we do that survey in 2022, that IEC number will be even higher than it is there in 2021. The point is that organizations are starting to take a more standards-based, that point, proactive approach to this. And so if we just take NIST, right, the first one on the list there, as we go through the things that we need to do for NIST, it comes back to security management, right? It's okay. I've got to have continuous visibility. I need to know my hardware, my software, my application, even if it's a complex network. I need to know my patch statuses. I need to know all my users and accounts. I can't just know what I might have visibility into from some spreadsheet I have or what's on the wire. I still need to know all the users and accounts. I need to be able to protect it. NIST is calling for everything from firewalls to endpoint protection to things like application whitelisting, etc. I need to be able to detect things, not just on the network side, but also the endpoint, configuration changes, etc. I need to be able to respond. Back to the point about least disruptive response for OT. And then finally, I need to know that I've got backups. I need to know that they're updated. I need to know that I can recover from the backups if I need to. All of this is kind of what we think of as proactive. It's much more than a reactive detection-based approach. It's very much a proactive application of security principles as we would in IT into the OT realm. Having said that, obviously OT is different. One of the questions that was submitted in advance is, what makes it different? I know there's a lot. If we think about the first point here, legacy equipment, there's things in there 30, 40, 50 years old, and it's not going to support modern IT security tools. You've got endpoints, which certainly can't be scanned, right? A PLC, a controller, sensitive devices, which if you scan them with a traditional vulnerability scanner or Nmap or something like that, you're going to knock them offline and potentially disrupt operations. And if we think about in IT, what we're used to is kind of an automated response or automated remediation, whether that be, every Tuesday I just push the patches, or every, if I see a threat in an EDR tool, it just automatically shuts down that process. I can't do that in OT. The type 2, so to speak, errors are too great. And so, and then you've got, most of the assets on Windows, so you can't really do the same things you would do on those devices you would on traditional Windows assets, et cetera, et cetera. We could talk for hours about why it's different. I think the reality is that when you walk into an OT facility, an industrial facility of any sort, the control systems engineers will explain to you very quickly why it's different. And so recognizing those differences is key. As I mentioned before, we've been control systems engineers for 30 years, and understanding these differences is really key to being able to secure them. The reality is, as we get into OT, we have to deal with these security realities. So, we got passwords often that are shared between IT and OT, or frankly, passwords that are shared across multiple users and devices, because when a technician needs to get into a device, they don't want to have to re-enter a password. Dormant accounts. So in the world of IT, we've got Active Directory. We're cleaning up accounts on a regular basis. In OT, without those types of things, a vendor may have been in there a year ago, and all of the accounts that we created for that vendor are still there. We've got old systems, XP, Windows 7, NT, a lot of dual homed devices with multiple NICs. That's how, in many cases, the control systems are architected. Many, patches that aren't approved by the OEMs to be deployed on these systems. And so there's a lot of differences and insecurities that are, as some people call it, insecure by design, that we have to deal with. We have to figure out a way to work through these challenges when we want to apply this proactive security approach. And so what happens is when you talk to the CISOs or you talk to, IT security practitioners who are, struggling with the OT, you get this sort of not a great set of options, right? Well, I could, each OEM has a set of tools. They're all kind of white labeled version of some IT tool. I'll just use those. But then somebody, oh my God, I got, 6 different OEMs, 8 different OEMs. Each one has a different set of tools. So I end up with, 48 different tools that I'm trying to manage. That's not very effective. Well, I could do passive network protection. I'll put something on a tap and I'll try and track traffic through that. But I'm not going to get any real detailed endpoint visibility. I can't do anything. I can't take actions. I can't patch. I can't remediate. I can't do the things around NIST that I need to do. I say, okay, we'll just do perimeter protection. Well, air gap. Okay, but that leaves the insides pretty insecure, and we could go around, right? No ability to plan, etc. So there's just historically the solutions just haven't been great at taking this proactive approach. And so what we're going to talk about today is, okay, there's some good news out there. You actually can do this. It's been proven, 15 years of doing this, we've learned how to do it. And so we're going to try and take you through an approach that actually is possible. So what's required to make this work? Well, we think about 5 criteria. First is OT safe. Whatever we do, the first thing is do no harm. We can't, as security practitioners, go in and disrupt operations. So the number one thing is OT safe. Visibility assessment proven to have no OT impact. You have to be able to demonstrate that. And then when we take remediation actions, making sure those are within the control of the control systems experts. The second theme is comprehensive asset visibility risk management. So if we're going to take a proactive approach, we really have to see the full visibility of the asset. We're not going to be able to patch after patch. It just won't work. So we need to see the full risk view, and we need to understand the compensating controls that we can take to address the risk, potentially without being able to apply that patch for 6 months, a year, 2 years in some cases, if that control system would need a full upgrade for the patch. And so we need to see that full 360-degree risk. And by the way, that's also required for being able to demonstrate to a regulator what we're doing. The third is proactive, what we call OT systems management. So we need to be able to then take actions to protect ourselves. Ability to take those actions like patching, configuration hardening, software management without disrupting operations. We need to be able to demonstrate auditable results from those actions, and then watch and monitor should those statuses drift. Configurations get changed, new users get added. We need to be able to monitor those endpoint changes to make sure we're still in where we want to be from a security point of view. It has to be scalable. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but we don't have the resources in OT to do this. So whatever we do has to be scalable, and it has to be done without adding a bunch of infrastructure. One of the biggest challenges in all of these OT environments is the infrastructure that's there and the complexities of trying to add additional cabling and spans and taps and all the rest of that. And then finally, we need to coordinate between IT and OT. We need to bring the OT data into enterprise security, and then we need to organize appropriately between IT and OT to get this done. So essentially, the rest of our discussion today, we're going to try and talk through these 5 elements, these 5 criteria, and how you can go about this. So OT safe. I guess in some ways this goes without being said, right? Anything we do has to be OT safe, but I think this is really, really important when it comes to starting to talk with our control systems colleagues about what it is we're going to do from our security. And there are some myths that have emerged about, well, you just can't do that in OT. As I mentioned, we've been doing control systems work for 30 years. We've pretty much seen every control system under the sun at this point. And so it's important to not just accept the myths, but to look at the realities. As we say, it's important to know what you can't do in OT, but it's really important to know what you can do safely. So first myth, vulnerability and patch management is impossible. Not true. You absolutely can have real-time vulnerability detection, and you can definitely do what we refer to as strategic patch management. We'll talk more about how we do that, but you can absolutely apply patches in an intelligent, purposeful way to be able to address the most severe risks. Number two, network packet inspection is the only safe way to gain visibility. Not true. You'll hear a lot about, well, I can't use an agent because the OEM doesn't allow me to use an agent, or oh, that will disrupt operations. Not true. We'll talk about how this works and how you can deploy software on these systems without causing operational disruption. Obviously, you need to do it correctly. You need to have the right approaches, the right change management, et cetera, but it's absolutely doable. Third myth, OT security must be done at a plant level because each plant is different, each process is different. And so I really shouldn't have anybody from IT or anybody centrally trying to do this. And the reality is, no, in fact, OT security assessments planning can definitely be done with a smaller central team. When you can, if you aggregate that data from every site, you can definitely gain scale in the analysis. Now, you don't want to go and have somebody from corporate 2,000 miles away pushing patches to your control system. Absolutely right. We'll talk more about the act local part, about ensuring those remediation actions are controlled locally. But from the analysis part, there's absolutely a way to scale that. And then lastly, IT standards, they don't apply to OT. We can't do the same things we can do in IT. So let's just throw out those IT standards. And we've seen time after time after time that you absolutely can apply those standards. Obviously, you're going to need to adjust them. You'll have to apply compensating controls in certain events. You might have to take technical feasibility exceptions for certain controls on certain types of devices. But the basics of the controls are absolutely applicable. We've seen clients apply the CIS 20 or 18 across IT and OT. We've seen them apply the same NIST frameworks. We've seen them apply these things. Obviously, it takes a little bit of work up front to get it right, but we can get to alignment. So those are just some of this. By the way, there's more than this. The point is not to just accept where we've been. We're going to have to change the way we think about this. Second key point, comprehensive risk. So as I mentioned, endpoint rather than just network, and getting that what we call 360-degree view of the risk. So first part is visibility, both endpoint and network, will form the basis of all the rest of what we do, right? We have to have that visibility. It has to be deep visibility, meaning all the way down into the network, and needs to be broad, meaning it needs to cover all of the information about those endpoints. So, for instance, not just good enough to know, well, I know the OS of the device. The OS of the device doesn't tell me what the patch levels are, because each of those patches may not appear as just looking at an OS version. It doesn't tell me the application software that's on it. I need to be able to see the flows, right? And what are the rules that are in the networking devices that allow those flows to occur? Users and accounts is a big one. I need to know what users and accounts are on the systems. Do I have admin accounts, local admins on a bunch of these systems that create risk? Do I have dormant accounts, as I mentioned, that a vendor came in 2 years ago and created accounts for their maintenance, and we just never got rid of them. I need to know the security capability status. So great, I got antivirus. Well, when was the last time that was updated? I have a backup system. Great. When was the last time that the actual devices were backed up? Anyway, a variety of things. That visibility, that ability to have all of that data is the foundation. It becomes the way we can start to do proactive management. It allows us to make trade-offs. We see all sorts of organizations say, we're going to start with network segmentation. And they literally get a year into it, and they're really struggling with it. And they're struggling because they don't know what they're segmenting. They don't have visibility into the endpoints or the flows or what has to communicate. And so then they're trying to, figure out what the endpoints are that they actually want to segment while they're trying to do the segmentation. Visibility has to come first. Anyway, a variety of different elements of why we need to get that visibility. And so, as I mentioned, getting that deep asset view is absolutely critical. Getting all the way down. For instance, a lot of these embedded devices have a backplane. Well, outside that backplane, to go through that backplane, not only cards, but I may have cards and PLCs, et cetera, tied into that backplane out the back end that don't appear through a network device. I need to be able to see that. I need to get through the backplane to the devices that are behind it. I need to see, for instance, bringing in user-defined risk and criticality data. So many organizations will have some form of a DR type process or definitions of which devices are most critical in terms of their operation status. Great, let's bring that in so we can start to prioritize that. Let's bring in configuration compliance. So oftentimes we can take hardening steps on these devices. They may not tie into a GPO, but we can take hardening steps on these devices and monitor that. So anyway, getting deep into the ocean, so to speak, is key to begin this journey. And the approach that oftentimes is offered for this, which is, okay, well, I'll watch what's on the wire, and so I can see that, and that way I'll be able to know what my assets are. It's just not sufficient to do in a proactive approach, right? I know there's a Windows box if I have a span port or a tablet, but I don't know patches. I don't know the policy device. I don't know all the users, dormant, etc. I don't know the applications unless that application happens to be running. I don't have the actual rule sets from the conduit. So if I think about IC 62443, right, zones and conduits, I don't have the rule sets that are allowing the conduits to work. I may not be able to see through those backplanes because those devices aren't going to communicate up potentially to the switch where I have the span port, etc. And so we got to find a way, if we want to do this proactive approach, to get beyond just the network information. And so the good news is there is a way to do this. To do it vendor agnostic, meaning it doesn't require a different solution for every vendor, and where we can actually get directly to the endpoint. This is the Verve solution. My guess is there are others out there, but the point is it is possible. That's what we're trying to say here, right? Where you can have an enterprise reporting, bring all the data up to the top. You can have essentially a virtualized asset manager in each site, which then aggregates data from endpoints using agents, using agentless capability to communicate with those devices. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking, exactly happy to talk offline about this. But the point is that if you can design an executable that is small enough, that was designed specifically for OT, that's been tested on all the various OEM platforms over a long period of time, you can actually get IT-like security in OT safely, effectively, no disruptions, no need, for instance, to reboot the machine, no WMI calls, none of that stuff that causes possible disruptions. And then for the embedded devices, right, to be able to go to them based on their native protocols and pull back the critical information you need from a security point of view. It's feasible. It's feasible to get to those endpoints. And, back to the myth and reality part, right? You don't have to rely on just trying to pick it off and pack it. And this is really critical as we get into proactive security. And so, the way we show this is we think about it, that asset inventory essentially acts as the centerpiece of the system. And then as you go around it, vulnerabilities, patches, configurations, malware, et cetera, anti-malware, all of that comes into an integrated system so that we can see all of the pieces coming together. And that's really key to what we're talking about here, is the ability to have a integrated system with all of the security elements in one place, anchored with that robust asset inventory. And so that's kind of the concept of this platform that we can use to do this. And so from that information, it's going to show a couple of examples, right? So to be able to see vulnerabilities across all of the devices in your environment, right? So to know how many critical vulnerabilities you have, how many highs, to know the availability and integrity, confidentiality impact of those vulnerabilities, to be able to see it by type of asset, to be able to sort this by site, etc. Again, it's possible, right? We know that this is doable. We can get that visibility centrally to know all of the vulnerabilities in the environment. But then this 360 view, right? That machine essentially that we built for proactive allows us to prioritize. We can know, oh, geez, there's a whole bunch of commonly abused TVEs, WannaCry, Bluekeep, etc. There are specific assets that have compensating controls on them. So, for instance, that 308 down there, right? We can screen by, the device has no application whitelisting, there's no backup, and it's a critical asset and critical vulnerabilities. Great. There are 308 of those I really have to go after rather than trying to chase 30,000 vulnerabilities. Again, the reason you can do this proactively is you can bring all of that data into one place and see those trade-offs, because you're not going to be able to patch all of them. There's no way, right? You're not going to apply 30,000 vulnerabilities patches overnight, but I can focus on those 308, those devices that are most at risk with no compensating control. Similarly, I can focus on I can focus on accounts, right? Admin accounts that have expired passwords, right? So I've got passwords that are over 180 days old on admin accounts. I've got administrator accounts, multiples of them on individual hosts. I've got a whole bunch of inactive user accounts, again, oftentimes created during outages. I got guest and admin accounts. And so as we think about that 360-degree risk view, right, we want to be able to get into this level of detail, because even if I'm fully patched, if I've got a whole bunch of admin accounts on these devices, I'm incredibly at risk. So I need to be able to go and take care of these types of risks as well. And then also on the network architecture side, right? So whether it be remote access, often we'll see multiple remote access people, dual NICs going around the firewalls. We'll see, misconfigured network devices. So often somebody designs the network segmentation appropriately, but then after a couple of years, you find that it's not exactly what you designed after all. You got dual homes, you got flat networks, et cetera. And so again, that 360-degree view allows us to see these network risks. And back to the point about visibility before segmentation, by seeing this, we then can take a much more proactive approach. All right, how are we going to protect this network? Yeah, segmentation is great, but we may be able to do a lot of things right away before we start, doing a full-on segmentation. Okay, great. So now I know those risks. I have that 360-degree view. Okay, now I got to go do something about it. I have to be able to take the action. And so the first thing we tend to do is we build a proactive, essentially remediation roadmap. We'll lay out things that we can do pretty much immediately to mitigate threats. Then there's kind of a next level, which is more foundational, right? We're going to build some of the basic foundations to go forward. And then over time, we're going to advance that. By the way, every one of these will be different, right? Different sites, different organizations, et cetera. But what we want to do is get down at a site level. We want to bubble up all that data centrally and then build site by site action plans where, okay, great, I'm going to go patch the most critical vulnerabilities. There's a whole bunch of configuration settings on those devices that I can harden. I have backups, great. So I'm going to make sure that they're updated. I'm going to implement password policies. Some things I can try and do relatively quickly, but then, it might take me longer to do sub-segmentation, for instance. It might take me longer to deploy application whitelisting or update AV signatures because I need to get those AV agents updated. Maybe, frankly, I need to get whole new agents to do whitelisting, etc. And so there's a series of steps that I want to lay out on a site-by-site basis to be able to remediate and proactively start to increase my security. And so the way we sort of portray this is to be able to go from the risk assessment piece across that 360-degree view and immediately start being able to take those actions. So as an example, patching. Great, I have the vulnerability assessment. I then can review those patches, approve them, download them, and start deploying those patches, obviously in a very OT safe way. So as we talk about, right? So there's some things that we can do now, there's some things we'll do later, and there's some things we're never going to be able to do, and we recognize that. We can test them, we approve them, we can automate where feasible. So, really encouraging not to use us to try and push these patches. It's very frustrating to use. You end up with lots of falses and false installs, etc. And then where required, deploy compensating controls where you can't deploy the patch. So this notion of moving from that 360-degree view to start taking proactive actions. And then that real-time management over time, because stuff changes. We get what we call rot, right? So it's great. So now we've cleaned up all the passwords, but next thing you know, passwords get changed. We've cleaned up all the software, but somebody loads TeamViewer on there for some reason. And so a number of things around risk reduction that may change that we need to modify and monitor for. Similarly, on the threat detection side or threat response side, we need to do things like deploying canaries. So a canary file is a small file that's never accessed on a Windows device or a Unix Linux device. And what it does, it accesses canary. So the minute that application or that file is accessed, we know that it's most likely a ransomware event because no one would access that file other than ransomware. And so that can set off an immediate alert to us that we can do something about. We can alert on microsegments, right? So if you've got a design where you want to have microsegments or subsegments in your network, great. Let's set up those alerts so we can see that. The point is that things can change in here, and so we want to be able to do proactive monitoring of the status so we can know when that rot exists. Okay, so great. It's going to be OT safe. We can see everything. We can start to take actions. But how do we do this at scale? How do we do this without, costing us a fortune? And obviously, resources is the biggest thing, right? So this is from the CISA KPMG survey a couple of years ago. The data is not changed at all. In fact, it's probably only gotten worse. Gartner just did a recent survey and came out with very similar results, which is, there's just not enough resources in ICS security. And so we can't afford any inefficiencies, right? We can't have silos. We can't try and do this with, every site on an island. And we can't do it where we've got 48 different tools because each vendor's got their own solution. We need to find a way to scale. And so the way we've approached that in this is what we call think global, act local. What we mean by that is we're going to take and consolidate that data from all of the plants centrally, right? So we're going to get every site, every plant, whatever it is, your environment, every boat, every ship, whatever it is, it's your environment. And we're going to centralize that into a common database. Therefore, we can scale that. We can use a fewer number of resources to prioritize this. In some global organizations, you might be a regional subject matter expert, depending on how distributed you are. But then, as we start to take actions, as we start to take those remediating actions that we just discussed, those have to be controlled at a plant level. Now, we can design them, we can plan them, we can distribute those actions for automated deployment to the local sites. But to make sure it's OT safe, we want to make sure that the control systems engineers at the sites have control over those actions before they get taken. We don't want to patch things during a run, possibly. We don't want to start removing accounts that we haven't reviewed with the OT practitioners on site. And so this is a way we can scale, but also ensure that we're OT safe and we have the control systems engineers deeply involved in any remediating actions we're taking. So I won't go through this page. We'll distribute this, but these are some of the example activities that an organization will take at these different levels. From the local level, we're executing patches, we're conducting change processes, and up at the central level, we're analyzing the network data, the endpoint data. We're developing recommendations for various remediations. We're addressing compensating controls so that we know which compensating control we're taking and developing those playbooks for that. And then finally, IT and OT coordination. We need to bring these groups together and not end up with two different silos not working together. And so using that same framework of think global, act local, right? That global team can analyze the vulnerabilities, right? Leveraging a single SOC where we can get data into that SOC, identifying IOCs, right? Let's not do that twice, et cetera. On the local side, though, on the OT side, great. That team needs to understand and identify what's the feasibility of that remediation. When should we be taking these remediation actions? They can be eyes and ears to look for operational disruptions, a range of things that OT does. And then together, that team needs to come in and do the risk assessment together. They need to do training and awareness, right? So we need to bring IT's knowledge of this and introduce that to OT to do training. Together, that group can create the standards. Terrific, we're going to use NIST CSF as our standard. Now we need to get into the details. And a joint team between IT and OT come together and create those details. And so our strong view is to bring these two groups together very early on in the process. If we're going to start taking proactive security approaches, we need to have both sides in the boat right from day one. And then whatever we do from a technology standpoint, from an OT systems management point of view, that needs to integrate into an IT system management. It needs to be able to integrate with enterprise risk systems, the enterprise SIM, the enterprise, CMDB, ServiceNow, whatever it happens to be. And then it needs to be able to bring in enterprise data, such as firewall alerts or OEM approved patch lists, or integrate with PAM tools. The idea is these systems need to work together. It needs to be one machine rather than, oh yeah, I've got OT security over there and IT security over there, and never the twin shall meet. We need to have basically data going in and out so that we could have a truly integrated IT/OT security management platform. So how do you get started? Great. So there is a way. That's good news. How have we seen organizations get started? And normally they start with a program that looks something like this, right? If I think about the NIST CSF across identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, over time they'll start assessing, right? So they'll begin this process with that 360 review, robust, detailed inventory, starting to establish some of the policies, et cetera. They'll then do an initial remediation, right? So there's always a catch-up phase, right? There's, oh my God, this is crazy. We've got all these vulnerabilities. The network's protections are not good. And so there's this initial remediation phase where we've got to catch up. We got to do a bunch of network work. We got to do risky software. So there's, we got TeamViewer all over the place. We've got iTunes is basically DVD burners, all sorts of risky software, et cetera. And then once we get through that initial remediation, we can then move into a maintain mode where we're monitoring for the changes, we're monitoring for new vulnerabilities, we're regularly doing patching where we can. When we can't, we're regularly doing updating our mitigating controls. And so this is the kind of the typical approach that we see organizations go through in such a program. And once you do this is an example of the NIST CSF, is we can start to monitor, how did we do, right? How are we progressing, right? And we can start, this is a client that, did some initial scoring prior to going through the program. And then as they started to deploy this proactive approach, they then a year later reassessed and said, okay, how are we doing? And they could see that they were able to measure against those key areas how they had improved, right? And in a year, they had about a doubling of their scores, and obviously it continues to go on. But the ability to see that kind of and measure that kind of improvement without having a big increase in headcount, and without impacting operations, which is the most important, right? Point number one, OT safe. For them was a pretty effective way of going at it. So in summary, again, we strongly believe that a proactive approach is going to be needed with these risks, regulations, et cetera, that are coming. And so these are the 5 criteria that we think you can apply to go after this. OT safe, comprehensive visibility and risk management, proactive OT systems management, getting to scale with the think global, act local approach that we discussed, and then bringing IT and OT together to really do this as a single effort rather than as multiple efforts. So with that, I'll bring us to an end of the primary discussion. And we've got some questions. It looks like there's one in the Q&A. I'm going to just start with, there was a question, a couple of questions that hopefully I've answered mostly, but questions around what are the biggest differences in IT and OT. Hopefully we've talked a little bit about that. Question was around how often do you typically see organizations update devices if those devices, if it's not possible to just patch every Tuesday, and if these devices are really sensitive. Typically what we'll see is an organization once a year will try to do all of their patching, complete all of their patching. So in other words, there may be critical patches. There's a lot of patches that can be deployed on redundant systems. There'll be patches that can be applied with, that have been approved by vendors that can be applied more quickly if you can reboot a system, because almost all patches require a reboot. But if you've got redundant systems where you can take one offline and do patching, et cetera. So there are some things we can do quickly, but oftentimes organizations in their annual outage will use that time to scale up the patches that are approved, but that they couldn't do in between. If we take embedded devices like PLCs, et cetera, those may actually require a full sort of control system upgrade. And so in many cases, those are not even applicable, but can be applied even within that annual cycle. And so therefore, we're focused very heavily on compensating controls for those embedded assets where we can't immediately update the firmware. How to coordinate IT and OT. Hopefully we talked a little bit about that. There's a question here from Sanjay. What level in the Purdue model does the asset inventory go to? So we would argue you need to get down to at least the level 1 assets. If you can get, there may be some assets at level 0 that you want as well. It depends a little bit on how those assets are connected as to whether you need the inventory. It's great to have it, right? But whether you need it from a security point of view, but certainly at least to the level 1 layer in the Purdue model. Now, we can all debate whether the Purdue model is the right model anymore. I think there's a lot of questions that that's probably not the right approach anymore. However, it's a good vernacular, and so that's typically what we would see. And then there was a question around, just given the rate of what we can do to remediate and the maturity of these networks, how do you deal with those things? How do you deal with the fact that you can't remediate everything immediately? So these networks are old. And so hopefully we've talked a little bit about that, but the primary way that we think about that is mitigating or compensating controls. The reason we're so focused on this 360-degree concept is that we want to be able to see all of those compensating controls to know if they're actually in place and that we have that compensation for that patch we can't deploy, right? So great, we can't patch it, but is antivirus up to date? Is the whitelisting that we have truly in lockdown, right? Is it really limiting the applications that run? That firewall that's sitting in front of that device that we're using for compensating control, what's the configuration on that? Has it been changed? Is it hardened? Can we see that config and analyze it? Is the configuration of the Windows device that controls that PLC, is that hardened? Or is password status, we don't have any hardening of passwords, we don't have any hardening of lockouts, etc. And so the ability to see that 360-degree view is really critical in the ability to deal with remediation that we might not be able to take immediately for patches. And then on the maturity of the network is obviously a problem. This is where, while we think segmentation is a fantastic solution, we really encourage people to get to the visibility first, because you might find there's a lot of things you can do on the network side in these older networks that will add security before you've bought all the new switches, new firewalls, and implemented them, which can often take a long time. But there may be lots of places where you can get rid of dual NICs. You've got a firewall in there that just happens to be poorly configured. You got switches that maybe you can enable VLANing. There's a lot of things you might be able to do even with these older networks, short of having to buy, whole new switches and hardware, et cetera. And then one of the questions, does zero trust mitigate a lot of those risks? So zero trust in OT is it's probably a whole separate conversation in of itself. First of all, defining what zero trust means in general. But if we think about it in OT, and it kind of goes with this other question around the access control in the lower level, trying to apply true zero trust in OT is very, very challenging, given the way that the OEM vendors design their systems. Most of these systems don't have access control passwords on them. They don't have user accounts. And so zero trust at a PLC may not literally be feasible. Now, you could do zero trust possibly at the HMI if those systems can handle the types of software required to do it. But we have found that true quote unquote zero trust, as we think about it in more the cloud IT side, will not be truly feasible in OT. And so we're going to have to find additional manners of reducing that risk at the endpoint level, et cetera. So with that, I think we have time for one. So how are you thinking about cybersecurity in OT, IIoT, and cloud environments? So I think we've talked a lot about the OT side of that. So on cloud, more and more of these systems are connecting to the cloud, at least to send data out to the cloud. So in that realm, we think a lot about the network protections that we put in place as the data is communicating outbound to the cloud. And so whether it makes sense to have OT data connections inbound from the cloud in. Just some examples recently here where one of the folks who makes and manages wind farms was impacted by a cyber event, and they require their customers to have inbound access to the generation facility, the generators, so that they can do tuning, et cetera. Well, that becomes a big issue for operators when I now have an inbound access from the cloud to those devices. And so I think there's going to be a lot more discussion around those access, the ability to access inbound to make changes from the cloud without some form of brokering happening at the OT level around access control. I'm not going to focus on how to do cloud security itself. I think there's tons of people who could talk about how to secure your Azure environments, et cetera. But I think where your OT is going to get in the game is, okay, when that stuff starts coming in, how are we brokering that transaction as it comes through the IT/OT firewalls and separations? So with that, I think we're at the end. Really appreciate everybody joining us today and the questions. As I mentioned, we will be sharing